Welcome to the Classic Adventure Gaming Podcast. My name is Gus, and tonight I am not joined by my boy Josh, but do not fear. Josh is going to be with us in spirit as we wanted to change it up a little bit for the next episode or two and try a one on one interview format. So, in this episode, I've invited a gentleman who goes by the Discord handle Arbrethil, or Arb for short, to discuss integrating mass combat and domain play into your fantasy adventure campaigns. I've had the pleasure to interact with Arb over on for the last year or so on the Adventure Conquer King Discord, and I've found him to be one of the finest representatives of that particular system. But more importantly, he is someone with significant experience running long-term campaigns with a focus on mass combat and domain play of all varieties. So my hope is that this will spark your interest in these modes of play and that these will be the beginning of conversations on the podcast with the core group of guys, as well as future guests with expertise and best practices for integrating many different modes of mid to high level play into your games. So before we jump into it with Arb, I also wanted to just apologize. My voice has been going a little bit and was pretty bad during the podcast. I think I pushed through it and it turned out okay, but please be aware that just trying to get over something and lost my voice over the last few days. So thank you guys for bearing with me, and let's jump right into it with our guest, Arb. All right, everybody, welcome to the episode. I've got is it Arberthil? I usually could just call you
Yep.
Arb, but what's the proper pronunciation here for your handle?
Arborthil is great.
Excellent, excellent. So I've got Arb with me, Arberthil. Today we're going to discuss, kind of get into a decent little conversation here. We'll see how far we go on mass combat and domain play. So Arb, welcome. Thank you so much for taking the time out to have the conversation. If you wouldn't mind, could you give everybody a little bit of background on your personal kind of journey in gaming, wargaming, RPGs?
Yeah, sure. So I've been board gaming for a long time. It was in high school that one of my teachers got me playing new school D&D with him, but he was running the old Against the Giants modules and converting it on the fly. So that was a pretty natural impetus towards more old school play. And that was just kind of how he ran things. It was more flexibly, more strategically rather than the tighter tactically. Which got me looking to run my own games, looking to look for systems, tried out quite a few different things, but where I'm at now is mostly with apps and just trying to because I was looking for systems that build over time and change and develop while still remaining the same system. That was something I really liked there that I was looking for that I think like you can see in a lot of the older school games in general.
I'm curious as far as like, because I came from the board game world too when I was very young. That got me into gaming, period. And so I'm kind of curious. Like for me, that was I don't know if you knew this game was very. It's like I think it came out in like '80. It's called Dark Tower, and
Okay, yeah. Yeah, I've heard of that.
yeah, between Dark Tower and Risk, and then obviously like my fantasy journey, like fantasy games, really came about because of I definitely did the Dark Crystal thing, The Secret of Nim, like Hobbit, the animated Hobbit, Lord of the Rings, like those really
Yep,
like
yep.
sparked. I'm curious, like what were the board games for you, or any other games actually for that matter, that really got you like, this is the hobby that I want to invest significantly.
Risk was definitely a big one, and later diplomacy definitely was something that shaped that and was what started me moving in that direction. And then reading, just as you said, a lot of fantasy fiction, getting into Paul Anderson and the whatever the book, the series was about the pig farmer. Man, I can never remember that. That was great.
Nice. Yeah. I just touched Paul Anderson with the Three Hearts, Three Lions. Loved it. So I picked up a few more. I can't wait to get to that.
It's good stuff, and it's very clearly an inspiration for Dean. plus Tolkien and all of that, and getting into that and looking to run my own games or whatever, need to figure out how large a kingdom would be so that I could map it. And just looking into demographic information online, looking into the different domain play systems that are available, like looking at Pendragon, looking at Ars Magica for very different takes on that from how old school D&D tends to do it. But I like the power curve of D&D. I like that it changes when you play it and that like you can start out as a dungeon crawler and you get to eventually become a king or rule a realm. That's really cool. I like that. Matches a lot of those sorts of fantasy heroes that start out as a sheep farmer's daughter or whatever. And
Nice. So you've been engaging with these elements of the game from like the earliest, like you were inspired to kind of get involved, even with your first. It sounds like with your first couple of RPGs to like actually dive in and want to start doing domain play, want to start doing mass combat. Um, would you say that that was something that was part of your early games, or did you generally start with doing the traditional, like starting town? Go off to the dungeon, do that normal rigmarole for your first one? Or did you maybe you started with a module like B2? Kind of curious.
the first game I ever got invited to be a part of it was just roll up a high level character. We're running against the giants. So come delve this dungeon and we're going to kill a bunch of giants. And that naturally spiraled into the Underdark series. And like all of that is kind of dungeon crawling, but it's also very much, there's huge numbers of people in play. You have to engage in kind of the strategic level of that, which I think then naturally did lead me to thinking about like, well, if I'm going to run B2, which was the first module I ran, uh, good call there. It comes down a lot to like, why hasn't the local lord dealt with this? And B2 had some answers there, and that was cool. But I wanted to dig into that and figure out like what it would take for him to be able to deal with it. Or like if PCs wanted to go to another lord nearby and see it, they could enlist his aid in dealing with it with some soldiers. Like what level would they even have to be in order to be taken seriously? Sorts of questions that come up. The other big module I ran early that definitely shaped a lot of it was Caverns of Thracia, which was outstanding. I've run that half a dozen times now, probably.
Yeah, that is a great one.
It does kind of the same thing where just the orders of battle, there's a lot of beastmen in there and trying to it's not super clear. So I was building orders of battle anyways to understand what sort of forces are available there. And then once there's PCs operating nearby, like, well, maybe there's gonna be 2 dozen beastmen that go hunt them down by night. At which point then they're looking to hire mercenaries. And at that point we got a small mass combat scenario. And it only gets bigger from there.
Love it. Love it. That's awesome. Yeah, I had the opportunity to play a few sessions of Caverns a couple years back, and I didn't get to finish up with that group, unfortunately. But it inspired me to go take a look at the module, and I had the foresight. I got it maybe a couple pages in. And I'm like, you know what? I want to play this. Don't ruin this for myself. So I put it away, and I haven't got back to it. But everything that I've read, which has been a little bit, everything I've played and everything I've heard has only been phenomenal. So I'm either at some point going to run this completely start to finish. Though for this one, to be perfectly honest with you, I would love to be a player in it before I actually run it. So, but for me, that's just how it is. Like the classics, like I haven't got around the Giant series either. That is definitely high on the bucket list. I think I was just talking about that with somebody recently, but yeah, the G series is there's so many classic modules, and there's just not enough time in my life to,
Yeah.
to play these things. So I'm gonna get around to some of them though. That's one of them for sure, and so is Thracia. So that's cool that you started with. I love the fact you started with giants. Like B2 is not
Yeah,
a
right.
hard B2 is not a hard guess because most people probably started with B2 if they're of a certain age. But to start with giants, I think is pretty cool. So
It was pretty funny. My very first time sitting down at the table, I was there figuring out how this goes. DM pulls out a map and starts drawing on it, and one of the other players is like clutching his head and like commenting that he just marked up a 30-year-old map or something and just drawing all over it to indicate where we're at and what's been happening, and it was cool. It was definitely different to start out at that level of power. Definitely going back, I tend to start at first level. The first few levels go quickly anyway, so I haven't really seen the need. But I think it's definitely certainly shaped how I look at things. The fact that like I got to see that high level play at the beginning, so there wasn't ever any like presumption in my mind that low level play is normal or like that's how it's supposed to be.
Yeah, I to a degree, I feel for, and this was kind of partially my story. Was I didn't get into RPGs until later, and I didn't discover fantasy adventure games until even later than that. But so circa 2013, when 5e was coming, thing that's when I finally like took the plunge. Some friends convinced me to finally play because I've been playing board games, war games all the time. So that all that led up to me finally finding old school games slash fantasy adventure games, and I was introduced to the 1 through 3 play for a very long time, and I loved it because it was a contrast initially, because of the lethality as well as like player skill being a major factor. Skill systems just weren't my. I didn't find them engaging. I just liked everything about adventure gaming way more, and I had no idea. Like I was slowly learning, and as I came to it, I was like, yes, I need to play much higher levels. Like I need to see this, see what this looks like. And so I've always been, ever since then, which is probably about 3 or 4 years ago, I've been pushing my games to get higher and higher and engage with all the different, what we'll call modes or types of play, like mass combat and domain play, because I really feel like they're underserved,
Yeah,
with the
yeah.
current in the current market, right? And I think you agree with that. So that being said, your background, which is real cool. Over the last several years, kind of what have your campaigns look like? Do you DM more? Do you play more? And then kind of just give us a quick, a little taste, a little flavor of like your most recent campaign or two, like where things went, where you're at, what you're running.
Yeah. Yeah. Where to start? My most recent campaign that's really taken off and been going for 3 years now, uh, I called it the Shattered Lands was the idea that players are starting out in this war-torn buffer zone between 2 great kingdoms that are both the, like, competing remnants of the old empire, and they're building towards war again, and they're kinda left here in among these balkanized states that are gonna be just swept aside before that war to run around in there and, like, there's lots of it justified a lot of the ruins of old empire that are gonna be there, but also just the potential for a lot of rapid change sweeping through, and that really took off when players were in, like, the 2nd session, I think. It was just a notable point that an ambassador was coming through to a town that they were staying at with his small army of guards and such that they were coming in and they were going to negotiate a treaty that was securing one of these border towns so that potentially armies could move through there later. And the thief decided to start slipping in, and he got lucky and made his way into their camp during the night and made off with a magic sword and slit the lieutenant's throat. And they had soldiers after them after that and had picked their side in the war almost on accident and were running around all over. Uh, Ultimately, like they one of them did some favors and befriended a nobleman's son out adventuring in order to parlay that back into just a relationship with that family in general. He's now married the daughter there, and with the aid of her father, when just started to they started to establish a domain kind of off on the edges there so that they could try to sweep up some of the leavings once the great kingdom started going to war as they caught wind of that, and it everything just kind of keeps spiraling out of control there as things like his noble patron gets kidnapped while he's gone, by rivals that he hadn't paid attention to. So then he musters an army to go punish them, expands his domain, ends up getting involved in some larger skirmishes and acting to forestall larger war. And now it's looking like he's trying to bait away some of the vassals of those great kingdoms to try to form a coalition with him in the center to turn and conquer one of the other empires. It, which is just a really big sweeping scope. And it's what I really enjoyed there is like that's one player's arc. Uh Often we were able to play like a couple times a week with just different parties or with like different people would come at each times. So like the thief's arc, who has been trying to build his network of contacts and to find different people that he can work with in different towns, and got assassinated once, but a henchman managed to escape with his body, and then got assassinated again, but his body was ransomed by another PC. Like just his arc has been totally different, and at times in opposition to another PC there, which is getting into a bit of PvP elements, which I like. I think like players are in some ways the ultimate opponents for each other, in that like within the scope of a campaign, there is only so much there, and there's only going to be one emperor come the end of it or what have you. So like choosing who to work with and who to use as pawns and who's going to be your enemies, I think is just a really interesting element. And like certainly my experiences in risk and diplomacy drive part of that. Some of my players are more into that. Some of them are more follow someone's lead and they're happy to be a duke while he's king.
Very cool. So I think what I'm really curious on for you too is obviously you said you got this really grand arc for your characters because of choices they're making throughout your campaign. Like you said, I'm assuming you started these guys at level one, right?
Oh, they definitely started at level 1, and at level 1, yeah, I didn't have any of this planned out. I'd barely fleshed out some of these noble houses, but now they're really getting into that and digging up ancestral relics that I'd noted down in flavor text as coming from that house because I needed a place to justify where it came from, and now they're doing them favors by digging up their old relics.
That's cool.
It's definitely
So,
grown.
oh, that's awesome. So I guess two questions on to follow up on that particular campaign of yours. So, generally, the way that you set everything up, is there a kind of if and again, your players are going to choose this, so you don't have control over it. But let's just say that you pick the ideal players, and they are basically you, and they make choices. What would be kind of the ideal um, ratio of different types or modes of play for you? Like, how often do you like your games to include like each session, so we can break it up by session, or even inside of your sessions, however you want to define it? But basically, how often generally at your table are you going to have them doing something that's either like a dungeon delve or a layer delve, or hunting for treasure in the wilderness, what have you, right? um or mass combat, or engaging with those kind of domain elements that you just talked about, or the intrigue and espionage with like assassin you discussed. How often are those different modes of play happening at your table, and how kind of what's the ideal that you shoot for?
That's tricky because a lot of it changes in that, like, at low levels, a more dungeon oriented game works really well. As players get into higher levels, they naturally move more towards domain play. So it definitely changes over the levels, but I think if I was putting numbers to it, something like 25% dungeons, 40% wilderness, 20% domain, 10% mass combat. A little wishy washy on the last two. There, the specific ratio. I think wilderness is really important to me because it's the one that ties everything else together. In that, like, a PC party can go exploring the wilderness en route to a dungeon, or that can be in order to clear their domain and figure out a good spot for it, or it can be scouting for an army and looking for their enemies there. And that's kind of the like central thread. Whereas like mass combat is awesome. It's also like it it's a big deal when it happens. There's definitely some small scale, platoon scale mass combat that feels more like just part of wilderness play when you go out with a band of men to clear some layers or whatever. But like taking over an enemy realm is a big deal when it happens, and the impacts of that echo through a campaign for a while. So, like, I think it's easy for it to start to dominate things if it's not some handled carefully, or like if PCs. And like the problem there, of course, is that if PCs rely on it too heavily, their army falls apart. So part of that is that they themselves are going to want to be cautious and not do things that are in the long run suicidal. And figuring out how that all fits together is part of the fun of it. Part of what like the domain play element is that espionage and negotiations and talking with different groups and figuring out what their motivations are so that you can influence them and figure out where to put your army so that you don't need to use it. That sort of thing. That like strategic level on top of the tactical operational level. Dungeons are cool. I think some of my players would probably like more of them, but ultimately, I think I tend to prefer the wilderness loop over the dungeon loop because it ties better into those big combats and the domain play and preparation for that.
We will come back to the wilderness loop because I want you to describe kind of how you run your wilderness play. It's
Yeah,
very interesting to me how everybody does. Most everybody does dungeons the same. It's easily the most. I mean, there's a ton of advice on how to do it. There's a ton of games you can watch and play in, and people get very. I personally think people get very proficient at running dungeons. You can get you can get there's levels obviously. Like there's people that newer DMs that aren't going to run them well compared to somebody who's run them forever. But point is, people get pretty proficient because it's probably it is the most common type of play. I mean, it's in the name of the original game. So,
and there's
but
a lot of institutional knowledge around that. And, like,
yeah, absolutely.
we spent a long time learning how to do dungeons well.
Absolutely. So I think that it makes sense that that's meat and potatoes for most people. Wilderness is a little different. Same with city. Definitely not something that I feel is widely known. That's part of the reason we're doing the podcast.
Yeah,
Uh, these are areas of the game that just don't get explored and discussed enough. Again, because people don't generally get past level 3 or 4. Um, anyway, so we'll dive back into wilderness in just a second. But as far as kind of your ideal or at least the way that you see it, how do you at what levels is it possible for characters to engage in different types of play? Like I know it's definitely going to differ from rule set to rule set. But I feel a lot of it if it's a D&D game or a D&D derivative game, I feel like you can, and I could be wrong and correct me if you disagree with this, but I truly do feel like you could implement different types of play a lot earlier than I think most people can. But I'm curious, like, what your experience with that is, kind of when you start different elements when they come into play for you, like when those modes of play come in for your campaigns and for your.
yeah. So I think you're right that they definitely can come in earlier. I do think one rule that's specifically relevant to like when wilderness can come into effect is whether there's an evasion rule system in essence. Because BX has that, Axe has that. I don't think AD&D has that. And I would be more cautious braving the random encounter tables if there wasn't a framework around getting away that's fairly consistent. In that's how a lot of lower level parties engage with the wilderness when they need to, is the fact that they can. What I've seen is they run away a lot. Being able to actually win those fights is definitely a shifting point in the like fifth to seventh level range. As for like the domain play elements, I think a lot of that just comes down to what you're defining strictly as domain play. I think if you try to start I've had players try to start a domain at level 3 or whatever, and it can work if the campaign is built for it, and I've got some thoughts on, like, how to adjust things to make that work, but it's really not a great fit. But, like, a 3rd level character, on the other hand, I've had a 3rd level character who was, buying a really fancy house in town, and spending above his level in order to appear more important than he was so that he could be involved in courting an old widowed noble lady and or in trying to ne- negotiate with other characters or like a thief who was run I was running a solo game for just around one town who tried to consistently appear more important than he was so that he could have a little more clout so that the law would leave him alone after he made a few slip ups early and just otherwise to try to begin to get involved in that sort of understanding the political landscape, understanding who the factions are and who he needed to be careful of and who he might be willing to work with. That sort of play that feeds into domain play can be started from much lower levels. Because even like at the point of if you think about playing B2, if you're successful and you clear the Caves of Chaos, then the local lord there, you're probably got a nice in to be talking with him and to maybe do some more work with him. If you later establish a domain nearby, he's probably a natural ally. And that sort of priming the political landscape in order to be able to establish yourself is definitely a big factor there because, like, a fifth level character with a moderate army can definitely conquer a reasonable domain. They've got the funds by that point, they've got the ability, they've got enough of a picture of how things work to just take something from someone nearby. They're not quite important enough yet, though, to get away with it in the big picture unless they've been playing that game real carefully. So usually that's more like seventh to ninth level is what I've seen where players actually go to start conquering a domain proper if they haven't been really skillfully navigating things in order to have a good casus belli, have a good excuse that this baron wasn't paying his taxes and needs to be knocked off, but we're happy to back pay what he was missing and figuring out who that's going to work with and who that's not, and maybe who they can have done favors for already to call it legitimize that. That sort of social game there, I enjoy as a kind of game that the early dungeon and wilderness delving drives. And certainly my players seem to have reflected that, that like they're not going to delve the dungeon because it's there, so much as they're going to find a dungeon where they can arrange to get paid to delve it, or where they can make it sure that someone knows they're doing them a favor by dealing with it. And that's good for them. A little more work for me, but that's okay.
Nice little added benefit. That's cool. Yeah, no, AD&D definitely has a very extensive pursuit and evasion
Oh,
section.
good.
Yeah, yeah, it's
I need to reread the
yeah, it's in there. Yeah, most I would say most of the any of the old school. I think OD&D even has a piece on it as well. That I could be wrong
yeah,
on. I'm not an expert, but I for sure some of the
it's got
derivatives do.
something.
Yeah, like swords and wizardry, et cetera, et cetera. But yeah, and most of the D&D likes will have a pretty good evasion piece. But I think that's the point is in old school gaming, when I get new players at the table and I've got an AD&D campaign going right now in person, and I've got four consistent 19 and 20-year olds, young guys that are ready. We're taking a break from 5e and very interested in playing AD&D, and they've never played an old school game, so I have to definitely prepare them a little bit. Like part of it, I want them to learn on their own, right? Because that's part of the fun. But another part of it is just like there's going to be things that are going to come at you. It's that you have to just run from, and you have to be able to recognize that, and that is part of the game, and it's part of the player skill that you will develop that generally is not encouraged in other games, but is very much encouraged in old school. So as you learn as a player, not as your PC, but as you as a player, you could put that knowledge to use in your game. So, and that's highly encouraged. Anyway, so the main point of that was was that
That's a real part of the fun, I think, to see the change that happens there where, like, at first level, you encounter a couple ogres on the encounter table and you're running away. No nothing to be gained there. But when you come along at 10th level with your entourage of henchmen and whoever else, you could encounter 100 ogres and decide, yeah, we're going to rid civilization of this menace here and now. And it'll take 20 minutes. That's part of the fun.
that is part of the fun. All right, so circling back to your wilderness gameplay loop, what does that look like? How do you like to run your wilderness encounters? Like you said, your players are definitely trying to maximize their benefit from things they're seeking to go and do. So they're obviously going out and traveling. But when are they really engaging with what I like to call introduced to me? And I love the terminology is exploration out in the wilderness, which is hex flipping, like flipping hexes. You guys want I love saying that term, like you want to go out and start flipping hexes. Learn that from one of the guys on our podcast, Zerbis. So do your players generally engage in that, or they usually have a goal or a hook that they're, trying to come up or explore?
It depends a lot on the game. That like some games I've run, absolutely, and others less so. That Battered Lands game I described, they basically never went out just exploring. It was always because they have a treasure map that they need to go follow up on, which or because like there was some known threat in the area that they wanted to track down, or because they'd heard a rumor. Like it was always a rumor of an army nearby that they wanted to get a look at. It was always very directed. Go out, figure out find what we were looking for, or not, and get back. And like even in the late game, that's been their general modus operandi as they build and develop their realm of control in a different game. Like I've been playing around with a Frozen North game, which is definitely more strung out frontier. That's just exploring and figuring out discovering the ruins of prior civilizations that have been up there and trying to piece together what happened to them has been a much bigger focus of the game. And structuring it differently so that I think one thing I did there that made the wilderness more engaging in its own right, as opposed to like as a medium of transition between other things, was that I stalked it a lot more densely. I used like a dungeon stalking table for stalking wilderness and then interpreted things creatively to make it fit. But that sort of just a denser wilderness made it more interesting to explore on its own, I think. And it like the same sorts of things where like you can find unguarded treasure like you would in a dungeon. You can find traps where there's like this mountain pass, but it can easily trigger a rock slide or like just a river is a really interesting obstacle when you're low level and don't have a lot of tools to deal with it. Uh, and that's something I think I'll be doing more is even in a game where it's intended to focus more on the sites within the wilderness, uh, having more things out there or like running it procedurally as the exploration happens to just add some limited stalking, I think definitely helps.
Very cool. Definitely like that idea. So let's jump a little bit into the meat of this episode. Touched on it a little bit. So, how do you set up scenarios for your players to engage with either whether it be, and I'll let you take it. We don't have to get into whether it's going to be mass combat or any other type of domain level play, but how do you set up those? I know you talked about it a little bit, setting the scenarios. Players want to make sure that they do a favor for so and so. But yeah, so those scenarios that your players can start engaging with at the earliest levels that can eventually lead to, a mass combat situation or a domain level play opportunity, like in your game specifically. How do you set those up and how have your players engage with them? And obviously, any challenges that you run into while you're doing that and how you've kind of overcome those, find solutions, bad experiences maybe you've had trying to do it that you learned from, or just really great outcomes where you thought, it would go the way that it went and it did, that you just started using over and over in your games.
I think the big thing that I've found is that as a problem is that the status quo tends to be really resilient. And that's why it's the status quo. So if you if I build something as the way it's been and in any sort of stable scenario, it is really hard for that to change. So adding chaos, adding things where the unexpected has happened or where like things are going to have to change one way or the other creates a lot more room for adventurers who are rapidly rising in power to be of use to society as opposed to people that need to be stuck out in the middle of nowhere and kept from breaking things. And like it's a lot more feasible for someone with an army to make a name for themselves if there's room for that warfare to happen. So, like, civil war is a scenario I generally really like, in that you have something where everyone has entrenched interests, but it's all going to fall apart. There's a clear timer that, like, player actions can move, but, like, sooner or later, there's going to be something happening. That was something that I stumbled into with the Shattered Lands, but that I thought worked really well as a like you eventually have to engage with it because there are going to be armies moving around. There are going to be cities falling and being sacked. Even if you don't want to choose a side there, like deciding to not be in the city when it's sacked is probably a good idea. Or trying to rob the baggage trains of the army after it sacked them or whatever. It's very open-ended, but it ultimately is going to bring spread a lot of chaos that adventurers can exploit. Or like comparatively, like when I ran that solo thief game, the thief aspects of it worked pretty well. But he never really got involved in the setting as much because I made the city too big and the people in it too high level. And there wasn't anything that was tearing the city apart. There wasn't anything that was giving him leverage to use against them or like things that were turning them on each other that would have them hiring people like him. So there wasn't as a lot of opportunities there. It'd be like the adventure, the low level equivalent of building a world without dungeons. It's just easier because in my mind at least, like a lot of the fantasy fiction I've consumed has these great old empires and grand kingdoms and whatever. But unless there's the threat of the Dark Lord rising, and even if there is that, really, you need smaller scale things that can get PCs involved in that from lower levels. Whether that's just like a specific nobleman whose domain is being overrun on the edge of things and he'll take whatever help he can get, or a nobleman who's going to die soon and then his heirs get to fight over who inherits, or any of that sort of thing that is creating the same sort of chaos within society that we would expect within a dungeon. So that there are factions, so that there are traps, so that there is loot to be gained.
That makes a lot of sense.
Compete for the princess hand is something I've thought about and considered running for a while. I'm just not sure that it's a little too clean. I think it needs something to spice it up and to make it a little muddier so that some son of an important nobleman, whatever, doesn't just swoop in and take it. Like, what's going to make the princess choose someone who's a grubby adventurer? Needs something to if 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 her domain is under threat, if there's risks of a new religion spreading, then you start to add more leverage that can be gained and twisted. Which makes sense at some level that, like, the periods in history that are interesting to study are the wars, the chaos. Pax Romana is cool, but the interesting parts of it are the conflict.
Yeah, no, I mean that's what drives all these games is you got to have conflict. So I think that that makes a lot of sense. And you said with the Civil War component, I really do like that idea because you can have that on a very small scale, right? Where you have like just neighboring villages, right? That could have a back and forth, and they need a couple level ones to help a small group kind of head off the local sheriff or whatever, right? From the other town. So I
Yeah,
feel like there's opportunity there to exploit with the Civil War thing. I think that's a pretty good bread and butter conflict that you can rise. So for you, what does this look like at the table? And all you just say that could be the digital table or the physical table. But what type of activities, both mass combat and domain level play, and maybe we should probably get, before we jump into this, what are the domain level play opportunities that you present to your players? Now, some of this is going to be driven by rule set, but for you personally, what are you looking for your players to engage with? Like, what types of domain level play are you looking to engage with? I guess how do you define domain level play?
Definitions are hard. The big pieces that play into it is that it's like the things that the entrenched powers of the setting are already involved with. That you have kingdoms to be ruled and thieves guilds to be run and wizards towers to wait in the wilderness and work on their esoteric research. That it tends to be things that take a lot of time, that tend to rely on other people, tend to involve large amounts of money. So of course adventurers love that. And I mean, the sorts of hooks that exist there tend to be like in any game that has people who are patron types, who are offering a reward for someone to go do something, or who, if adventurers get active around town, well, maybe there's someone who can profit off of that by taxing them or by enticing them to buy this fancy mansion or whatever. Like that's kind of how those hooks start to propagate to players, I think, is when they start interacting with the people who have power for whatever reason, whether that's those people exploiting the PCs or those people trying to turn the PCs against their problems. So a lot of that in like setting up a campaign tends to come down to figuring out like within the area, what rulers do we have in each settlement? What sorts of entrenched interests do we have? Are there merchants guilds here that are prominent, or craftsmen's guilds, or mercenary companies, or just all of those different things? Starting to just build lists. I like making lists of that stuff and then looking over it and reviewing and figuring out who is related to who has worked with who in the past. Uh, and once there's a picture of what that sort of high level looks like, it fairly naturally propagates downward. That when I can look at that and see that there's some sleazy tax collector who's looking to ingratiate himself and thinks that these out of town adventurers with no social connections, he can take a fair portion of their money off their hands. And if it comes to a conflict, the town guard will support him. Great. That's a hook that can be thrown at them. And then they get to respond through that same sort of social interaction sphere, whether that's them claiming that they got it off their own land and that it's clearly theirs, and that the nobleman that they did a favor for last time can vouch for them, or if that's them offering to donate it to the temple instead and try to salvage something out of that scenario. If they're going to lose the money, then maybe at least they can get some credit with someone else for it. Or does that kind of get at what you were asking?
No, it definitely does. So yeah, that definitely gets at what I'm asking. I think that giving people concrete examples, I think is very helpful when it comes to people say domain level play. And I think the only thing anybody ever thinks of is building their castle because there's one page of that in BX. And so I think that that's literally the start and the finish for a lot of people is cool. I can maybe they get a little more inventive, right? And they're like, let's take over a ruins, and that could be like a base of operation, right? Once they get to third level or something like that. So I feel like at least from my experience, that's usually what I see, and it doesn't extend anywhere beyond that. But it sounds like your the way that you've set it up is I love the list idea, right? So you've got a list of a web connection basically of everybody within inside of
Yeah.
their traveling region, right? And then based on where they go and who they interact with, you could start triggering hooks within inside of that web that they can either, that they have to engage with or can choose to engage with, whatever, or at least there's something that they have to at least think about. And then those, depending on, again, and that's the depending part, right? Depending on how they engage, that will lead to a type of play, whether that's attempting to assassinate someone, or whether that's attempting to hire a bunch of mercenaries to go take out someone, or take out a group, right? Because they want to help out the local lord or whatever, like we mentioned before. I guess that's the other part of the question. So I know it's off the top of your head, but what are the most common domain level modes of play that you see as far as like if you were to just and you could define them however you want. So, assassins play like assassin guild play, right? Or something like Fafhrd and the Grey Mauser. So you're talking about heists and thieving, right? And those type of city adventures that aren't just find the which are great. Don't get me wrong, I love them. Aren't just find the dungeon within underneath the city, right? But are also you're doing stuff above ground, or you've got the intrigue, the spying, the espionage, the blackmail, all the different social dynamic play that's involved there. Through whatever else, like kingdom, like the high level stuff. So, political discussions and diplomacy, like you mentioned. I'm curious, like what you see are the most common in your games that players really like to engage with, and what are the least common ones, and why do you think they are more like less common?
Ooh, yeah, that's a big question. Uh, Let me think. So, in terms of modes of play, I think one of the basic ones that keeps coming up again and again is intelligence gathering, whether that's like scouting on an enemy army or whether that's like figuring out what sort of assets and resources someone has available by by kidnapping their bookkeeper or by sneaking into their castle and looking through the records or by chatting up the quartermaster in a bar or by trying to sell the quartermaster stuff. That sort of like or by hiring people to do any of the above. That sort of intelligence gathering thing is something that PCs tend to be better suited to than your average nobleman, and it's something that they're often able to leverage into gaining value elsewhere. The coalition building that we've talked about a bit is definitely a often attempted component. It doesn't work as much as anyone would like, but it's often a go-to of just can we get can we work with these people? Because if you can, it's nice. But and that again takes a lot of forms, whether that's like attending the ball to then try to figure out to try to sell someone some information and make friends with them, or whether that's trying to court someone's daughter in order to gain an in there and or trying to gain permission to court someone's daughter, or trying to help someone in their own courtship, or that's on my mind because players have been doing it recently. I think the feint is and I don't know if these are maybe too abstract compared to what you were hoping for, but the feint is definitely something that comes up periodically. I don't think it comes up a lot, which is that might be a skill issue. That might be something that if you use it too much, it doesn't work. See it more to figure that out. But just like creating spreading false information, false rumors, misdirecting people as to the size of your army or where it's at or what your intentions are with regard to one problem or another. Were you looking for more concrete things or is this the sort of approaches that you were looking for?
Yeah, no, I think that's yeah, those are the approaches I would say that I think could give individuals that have never played in this kind of an idea of or at least ideas, once they start engaging more with that seeing that as an opportunity in their game, not just looking necessarily as at NPCs as which one's going to tell me where the dungeon is, right? Or the most lucrative dungeon or the temple, right? It's out there in the wilderness, but looking at them as a playing piece that they could potentially use to help them with inside the city, to get more information from higher level folks or to whatever, right? Everything you just talked about from getting the hand of the princess to, which is an interesting one for me because honestly, in my adventure games, I don't think about that as much. It's like, I guess I could see it if there was like if I wanted to get like her dowry or something, right? Or I wanted to, you know,
Mhm.
wanted to get involved with the king because it was a way for me to help raise more for an army or he had some he had access to a wizard, right? That, there was this thing I had to get my hands on, some MacGuffin I had to get my hands on for training or whatever. then maybe I could see that being the case. But yeah, that's interesting. So just having the hand of the princess being something common in your games currently is interesting to me. What do you see kind of less of? What are the things that, or maybe you don't see enough of, but you wish players engaged in more in your games from a
I think
domain
soft
perspective?
I think soft power is definitely a tricky one to apply where you're trying to I think like blackmail, like you said. I've even got good rules for it. Players just haven't engaged with it a lot. Hard power with armies and whatever, we see plenty of intelligence, counterintelligence, coalition building. Those are all like pillars that I've seen interacted with plenty. I think the soft power element of trying to force someone to do what you want, even against their will, is interesting. And just the breadth of ways to do that to bring power to bear, whether that's like the sort of thing we see in the real world with economics and trying to taxes and tariffs and whatever that I'm sure never occurs to adventurers, or whether that's the like just putting pressure upon their allies, moving your army into a spot to threaten someone who has their ear, even if you're not going to do anything with it, but just to make a real subtle threat there, or trying to implicate someone close to them in corruption and hurt their image and potentially blackmail that person or blackmail the person you're interested in, even if you were or trying to set up a sting for that or what have you. I think there's a lot of potential there that I think is hard to get into in part because it's hard to really know how subtlety will be received and that like we're not master politicians. We would like to be, perhaps. We'd like to think we are sometimes. But I've definitely been in games on the other side where it's like I could make this really subtle move, but I'm not sure if the DM will actually get this. I'm not sure if in character the person that I am making a subtle move against will respond appropriately. I think and ultimately like adventurers have some tools that are applicable, but they're also generally pretty well equipped to apply hard power at that point. So perhaps I think I need more of the like 20 hit die dragon in a first level dungeon type encounters in a more social dynamic. Things where like you don't have a lot to work with just to see how players get creative there.
Interesting. Yeah, I definitely that's an underserved area. Though I think that one's interesting because, and this will lead into my next question. I think that when I'm playing a game, I want to engage with the excitement of the adventure. Like that's number one. And I think that there's, like you said, I like that kind of phrase, the hard power. I think hard power is where most of that excitement is going to be driven, where most of the external adventuring is going to take place, and where those exciting moments at the table are going to take place. So for you, for all these different uh, levels of domain play, I think what I personally have a hard time grasping, and maybe other folks do too, as well, is how how does this work? How do these domain elements work at a table with, you as the DM and five people around you? How does everybody participate in something like an assassin's, with the assassin going off and assassinating, or someone negotiating with the king for the daughter, for who gets to have the hand of the princess, right? How does that work for you with a group? And you mentioned you had a single game, like a solo game, so that makes sense to me, right? Because you got a single assassin, you got one player, you're running kind of a solo game for somebody. That I could see that. For me, it's harder to understand what's happening in downtime activity with these, and then what exactly is expected to happen at the table.
Yeah. So a couple answers for you there. First, Discord is actually quite a boon there, in that like if a player has something that's going to be time consuming but not like needing to be done face to face, we can just do it there. There's some negotiation that's only going to involve one player. I can handle that over Discord. It's just text back and forth any. Uh, on the other side of that, as to what this looks like at the table, uh, I think Axe gives me a lot of tools there that I find particularly useful in that, like, if I want to run an assassination, that could be something that we run at individual scale with like scoping the building and building maps of it and figuring out what the guard cycles are and whatever else there. Or that could be something where we call it an assassination hijack, and there's a roll to be made for that. And I can roll for how long it takes, and the assassin can roll for whether it's successful. And if it's against an alert target, then maybe that ends up with the assassin in his bedroom at night. And we can play it out at individual scale and it's quick like a combat. And if it's against some nobody that he just wants out of the way, then he can just kill it. And that's that. Or like if another player wants to do that, they can hire an assassin and we can just make the abstract rolls to do it. Likewise, if it's like armies on the board, it's generally pretty quick to move forward some like whatever is going on. Like whether that's spying on someone or moving the armies over time and doing recon and figuring out where your enemies are. Like a lot of that can be resolved fairly quickly at the table because a lot of it has tools that have been built to be abstract there to and then like if PCs do specific things that are going to have a bearing on that, I have a framework within which to adjudicate how that modifies things. Or like hiring an adventuring party to go clear a dungeon that is being annoying and they don't have time for is not something I would have expected to ever do, except that I have rules now to abstractly clear dungeons. And that's great. And of course, if PCs don't want to do it abstractly, then they can always send their henchmen and play the henchmen, which is fun too. Uh, as to how to how to do that at the table in a way that everyone is involved, I think abstract tools are definitely helpful in that it keeps things moving. So it's becomes less about like we're going to have a session about this assassination and more like an assassination is like your turn in combat that and maybe it's an involved turn that'll take a few minutes. But you can do that and then Jim is going to move his army and then Bill is going to check his magic research project and see if the adventurers he hired to bring him Medusa spleens are able to succeed.
Very interesting. So basically, they're all working on their unique at the table. The group is working on their unique domain level area. So if it's assassin going after somebody high, or if it's like you said, Bill shifting his army over, or you've got the MU it's got the research project, or basically whatever class they have their unique thing that they're working on. You can literally spend an entire session them taking turns basically on each of their unique things, like going around the table. And I'm genuinely curious because I've never ever seen this before.
To some extent, some of that'll get pushed out of session. So, like, the magic user is probably going to figure out what sort of project he wants to work on and run the math on that outside of session so that he can come with something worked out and I can look it over real quick and say, looks balanced, go for it. But yeah, or like a lot of it too, there tends to be a lot of tension in that, like, if they're at the same table together, they're probably doing related things. So if your assassin is assassinating the enemy general, then Bill is probably pretty invested in what you're doing and whether it succeeds. If it's his army is then moving into position to try to rout the army after you kill the general. And if you don't kill the general, then he might have to attack in order to rescue you. And Jim over with his magic research project is invested because ultimately you're doing this to secure a layer of power that he can use to like fuel magic research or because if you fail he's going to have to teleport over to come help rescue it. So like to the extent that they're at the same table and they're working even if they're working in different ways towards the same sorts of goals, it works out similarly to like the if you split the party and then run one party going through this part of the dungeon and then you cut to the other party running through a different part of the dungeon, it's a similar dynamic in as much as like if one party gets in trouble the other party might hear it or they might be able to do something with one party that distracts the orc guard so that the other party has an easier time getting the treasure. or what have you. And that as long as they're functioning still with a general sort of shared purpose, they're often pretty willing to see how it goes. If we have to do actual mass combat, that's probably its own session, unless we want to handle it abstractly, in which case we can do it pretty quickly.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense to me. I could see it if they all have a common goal in mind. Like you said, it
If they don't have a common goal in mind, I honestly would just try to run separate sessions for them, which obviously, like, not always a thing that can be done. But if it can be, that works great. And it creates fog of war. It lets them functionally operate towards PvP, even if it's indirect PvP, which I think is probably the best. People killing each other can get nasty, but like maneuvering armies and fighting over who's going to seduce the prince can be a lot more interesting. It's PvP.
interesting. And yeah, at that level, it makes more sense that they wouldn't just be knifing their fellow whoever in the back, their fellow PC that they, adventured 14 levels with or what have you, right? So it would
Yeah,
definitely be more. I'm gonna send an elite assassin squad at you, and you don't know about it. I guess for me, I mean, I could see how some folks would enjoy the PvP component of it towards the end, like towards the end, right? Especially if you wanted to like nice and tidily wrap up high level play, and everybody was like, "Yeah, let's start a new campaign." You could kind of
yeah,
start, it starts moving into PvP, so you could wrap it up. I could see that. I could definitely see that, and then also too, I think I would be interested in that personally if it was mainly devolved into kind of a big, war game, basically, right? Where you finish it up with like a battle and everybody's got their faction. That's a fun time with everybody at the table, right? At least that's how I see it. So I
battle
could
of
totally
five
see that.
armies.
Yeah, exactly. You got 5 armies at the table. To me, ooh, that sounds phenomenal, especially after like a year of campaigning or whatever. Like I get excited just thinking about that. And it's funny because for whatever reason, until you started talking about that, I didn't even think of that as like a scenario. But yeah, that's a PvP scenario I could definitely get behind. So I could see that. I like that. What other goals? I'm really
Yeah, so
interested.
sorry, I just wanna
Yeah, yeah. No, go
I
ahead,
wanna
please, please.
touch on that because I think there's a really interesting point there that, like, every society that's invented war, right, has invented limited war. So, like, the default, both for PCs and for NPCs, is like, if we're high level characters running around, we want to do this in such a way that we don't die. So we'll minimize risk. We're going to assassinate the generals in the field, maybe, but probably not the noblemen back home. There's ransoms and there's other tools there that make it a little more survivable. If it's the end of the campaign, everything's building towards it, you can absolutely have PvP in the field as two fighters lead their mighty armies against one another. But until you get into that sort of thing, I think once players have lost a couple high level characters to rash actions against other PCs, there's a lot of hesitancy there that, like, even I'm going to be hesitant to strike because I that could turn out badly if it's something that is going to come back against me, or like, even if I'm playing a high level assassin, I might send my henchman to go deal with a rival just because I don't want to get caught. That sort of like preservation of self makes a difference. I think once there's like, especially once people, as you said, are saying like this is moving towards the end of the campaign, that's a very marked shift in how people approach things.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So the concept of a unified goal always being present for me is I think how I'll probably so I think I'm starting to see the vision, if you will, of everybody doing basically their component of that unified goal. So, do you have some kind of concrete examples of your campaigns where you've got it doesn't even have to be like super high level, but basically just not, something fifth level or higher, sixth level or higher, where you've got the normal party that's got to that point together, but now they've got these extra abilities and they've got their own web, right, of NPCs that they've interacted with and developed relationships with. What are some of the kind of just in your campaigns how they have used those different abilities towards a goal, but then they've been separate, but you've been able to run those together at the table? That's a very narrow scope example that you may or may not have, but if you do, I'd love to hear it.
Yeah, so I think thinking so in the Shattered Lands campaign I talked about, one piece of that was that like their starting town, their starting city that they started out in and felt some loyalty to. They all kind of went off on their own ways for a while, but then they were busy and an rival army captured that and it was taken. And they considered that a personal affront and decided to get back together and take it back. And so like that started with the working out a disguise and coming in as a foreign presenting himself as a foreign nobleman of his own with some money to him, buying a house, getting in with the people there and trying to figure out what sort of political factions existed within the city, as he was like also putting spies in place to be able to open gates in the night and let an army in. While then simultaneously you have the fighter who was securing his armies at home and making sure that he had the local threats there dealt with so that he was able to basically take the time move his army away without losing things so that they could retake that. And you had a cleric whose brother and basically henchman. Uh, she wanted sh- she'd negotiated with the other PCs basically that she would help, but her brother got the city once they were done with it. He was the guy they were going to leave in charge. He would swear fealty to the fighter and pay taxes and whatever, but he got to rule that city. So she was able to negotiate for her henchmen a very nice domain there to get out of it. And those three and then she was able to deploy a whole bunch of divinations and to start to bring some of her own armies to bear on that. And that all played out. And there was there was some cool stuff there as well. And that like another element that made that work really nicely was that each of them had henchmen that they were able to send with each other. So like if we wanted to do a whole session about the thief running around this city and trying to prime it to collapse and be easy to take, that like the others had henchmen with the thief that they could run. And we could just do a session about that.
I like
And
that a
then
lot. Yeah, I like that a lot. That makes sense to me. I think the reason why, at least my personal concerns around it are one of the major focuses for the game for me is the pacing. So having everybody engaged is always to me a matter of pacing at the table. And so the more content, the more actions that are taken, the more interesting the game is going to be. So if turns are taking, I mean, we've there's horror stories, right, of people, taking 15 minutes to figure out what they're going to do on a combat turn, things like
yeah,
that, right? Just destroy games, like destroy a session for the night, right? So
yeah,
from your experience with each of these like turn, I could see like this that you keep going back to the assassin because it's probably easiest, but you have the assassin go out with some hinges that are sent from everybody else. And then you basically have, at least in my mind, you basically have what an adventuring party would be doing. They're just assassinating one session, right? That's a fairly common play style. But yes, it's adding to the overarching decisions that are being made by all the characters. So I could see that being a way to keep it moving and pacing correctly. But what do you how do you work it when it's, you're actually they're all working on the same goal, but they're high level things like moving an army, shifting it or doing intel or like we mentioned before with the research. How long in your experience do those turns normally take? Do you feel like they get bogged down or you could keep the pacing going based on how abstract the rules are?
a lot of it depends on proficiency with the systems and like how well the players know the systems. So like when we were learning the domains at war system that Axe uses for mass combat and such and for its like strategic framework, that took a while and that was something where like I'd try to run smaller sessions so that we'd have less people and they'd be more involved in things and that. And now we're getting better at that. We've got practice. We know what it takes and how fast armies move and what the constraints are. And nobody's surprised that their army needs to rest 3 days out of every week. Uh, and we can automate a lot of the reaction or a lot of the reconnaissance rolls that are made. And like I, as a DM, have more proficiency there to know what I need to automate on the other side to have enemy order of battles, what needs to be in there, what I can leave for later. I I think a lot of it, like there are some things that players can do that are just going to be removing a PC from the session for a while. If they're like, I want to make this magic item and it's going to take me 3 months, they are welcome to do that. And at which point they'll just play henches for the next session or two. If they, but like a lot of the army movement stuff, a lot of the hijinks, a lot of the other things, like I've had other sessions where like we will spend half an hour figuring out what's going to happen for the next month, what everyone's actions are. We advance the calendar a month. They get their new information, and then they figure out what they're going to do for the next month, and it just rolls smoothly. A lot of it depends on how busy the region is at the time. There can definitely be things where like the fact that the assassin's going to take 14 days instead of 13 days to slip in somewhere and gather a piece of information will make a difference, and we need to play out the what the fighter's army has been doing in the meanwhile. Usually though, so long as player I think what I've generally seen is that players ins- they hire henchmen in order to become somewhat sufficient, self-sufficient, as opposed to like doubling down on their specialty. So like a fighter PC is going to have cleric and thief and wizard henchmen. He might also have a couple fighters, but like he wants to have people to cover the different bases so that he can function self-sufficiently, and that in and of itself acts as something of a buffer that like he's not going to get bored because whatever the topic happens to be, he has a guy who can be involved in that. He has a guy who knows what's going on there. Maybe the wizard has that maybe the party magic user has agreed or like has asked to have his henchmen involved, have the fighter's henchmen involved in a magic research project so he can get it done a little faster. Maybe his thief is off infiltrating a city with the assassin PC or whatever. I think that it's definitely possible for it to get bogged down. And like if things are going to get super bogged down, I could split out the session for that. But as long as PCs are moving towards the same sorts of goals, I think they generally get invested in what each other are doing. And as long as that is happening and they have a broad array of henchmen, they generally have like figuring out what their henchmen are going to be doing and how they'll be contributing to whatever the scenario is can definitely occupy them on its own there. That makes sense.
It does. I think so. Are there particular scenarios or domain play scenario like types, modes, whatever that however you want to define it that just in your experience lend themselves better to I completely agree by the way. Downtime activities in Discord has been fantastic. Um are there particular ones where you just it's usually better to do it in between sessions and then, but there are other things that just are more engaging and so you make sure that they're done at the table.
I think army movement tends to be more engaging because, like, with each move, your scouts go out and bring in new information, and that can be very relevant. That tends to be more interesting and dynamic there. Thief actions tend to be very fast to resolve if they need to be. So that tends to be pretty easy to resolve at the table. There are definitely magic research projects where like there's not a lot of rolls to be made and there's not really a lot of information that's going to change. So it's easy to figure out what you're making and then roll for it out of session. Uh, I think definitely mass combat itself, if there's like I've had some things where players said, "Yeah, we just want to resolve this with the quick abstract method. We don't need to take a lot of time on it." But then other things where like that city that I was talking about being attacked, that was a session. Attacking that city, that was a session on its own that we dealt with that. Wasn't a terribly long session, but there wasn't any it's involved enough that there's no way you're gonna resolve other things in parallel with.
Nice. Yeah, I would assume an attack on a city would be excitement enough to keep the pace moving along there. So yeah,
I'd just add that I think a lot of the general typical advice for, like, when the party gets split applies to keep cutting between them, uh, is useful to get them to a point where, like, they can start figuring out what they're going to do next and then cut to someone else. Keeps a nice flow, keeps people moving, keeps them thinking when it's not their turn. A lot of the domain play type stuff that the actions will do is like each action once taken reveals new information, which is useful. It's a useful property in that, like, once you've taken your turn, new stuff reveals that makes you reevaluate that. So all of the standard advice that comes up with, like, if the party gets split up in the dungeon, how to manage two separate parties in parallel or whatever applies pretty similarly. It's not one to one, but it's definitely similar.
no, that's good advice. As far as domain, like, I think that kind of definitely wraps up the main questions I think we had around domain play, mask. I'm curious. We talked a little bit about your formative years and the modules that you were introduced to the game, how that formed your tastes to some degree. Are
Yeah.
there any modules for somebody that's new or isn't experienced DM but has never really implemented any of this or ran any of these scenarios that we've talked about, these play modes that we've talked about? Is there anything current like that you would recommend is a must buy? Like, does a great job as either a teaching tool or the implementation is just excellent around whether it be mass combat or any type of domain play that you found personally to be excellent examples.
I have really enjoyed Ole Skrogren's modules. That's like the Sudden Siege for the Cup of Wonder and Temple of Hypnos are his. Tidal Tower of Terror is a few others. Uh, they have been consistently very well done. Uh, Temple of Hypnos was a No Art Punk 1 entry that was solid, mostly adventure tier module. His others get into definitely more domain adjacent scenarios where, like, one of them's about like an army marching on a city that possesses an ancient relic, and maybe you will be spies to let that army into the city. Maybe you'll go steal the relic for them. Maybe you will go hire an army to support the defenders. Maybe you'll stall the attackers. Maybe you'll kill off attacking leaders to get them to go away. Like, it's very open ended, very solid. All the important stuff is there. It's very well done, and I believe they're all free on Drive Through RPG. So I would certainly recommend those very highly.
Nice. Yeah. I am a big fan of his work as well. Temple of Hypnosis, so good. So I have plans to put that into a campaign. Not happened yet, but is definitely in the works for me. So his stuff is excellent. Good to hear.
The the
Go ahead.
Eerie of the Dread Eye is one of the apps modules, the official series. Courtney Campbell made that, and it plays really nicely. It's got some more gonzo stuff in it for people of that sensibility, which I think is uncommon in this sort of thing. It has a lot of adventure, like high level adventurer scale challenges, but it also has just like the numbers involved tend to be very large. Certainly, when my players engaged with it, they were hiring and allying with one faction in order to take down another faction in a mass combat of like maybe 400 combatants. So, like, not huge, but definitely middle sized, that I thought was well done. And it was like, it's a really good dungeon in its own right. So it's an easy transition. And then I think something like I, looking at Vaults of the Drow or B2 and looking at those modules as war game scenarios, I think is another thing that just you can kind of reframe what they look like. And like if B2 is reinterpreted as a war game, like you have all of these beastmen factions that you can kind of meld together and form a mixed army of a few hundred combatants. You've and I think what it's missing there chiefly is like stakes and a reason for the defenders of the keep to leave their tower. But once you flesh that out a bit, I think a lot of those old modules are designed by people who are into war games. So like they carry over a lot. Like Vaults of the Drow, whenever I've read it, has struck me as like this is very much seems designed that like if I stuck this in here, like when the PCs first encounter it, they're not going to be coming at it with an army. But if they make it away, they might come back. And if they did come back with an army, I have everything here I need to run it.
Very cool. Yeah. Always interested in, even though it may not be explicit in a module, modules that lend themselves better to adding these elements in. So that's cool that Vaults of the Drow for you is definitely that.
It was certainly what I thought playing through it early in my D&D career, where it's like getting into a fight that's totally lopsided. It's like, well, okay, we're we're gonna come back. I don't think we ever did come back, but I certainly wanted to, and I wanted to make sure that it was just as lopsided the other way the next time.
So I'm gonna put you on the spot a little bit. When are we gonna get to see an Arbrithil original adventure on drive through or wherever you would like to release it?
If I can wrap it up in the next 11 days, you'll see it in No Art Punk 3.
Oh, nice. You're working on a Noir Punk 3. Awesome. That's great.
Yep. It's not super war game heavy. It's more for like high level adventurers who bring their army with them incidentally because it's useful than as a like conquer the kingdom type thing. But there definitely is like war game support there and like you're getting a few hundred troops with your pre-gen character. So, it's not nothing.
No, that's definitely not nothing. I mean, it's pretty obvious that almost no one, or at least that I'm aware of, designers other than maybe Ollie, is putting out consistent stuff that part of your pre-gen comes with a built-in platoon, even a platoon, let alone a company, right? So I feel like that's the more that it gets shown that this is a lot, it just adds another layer of rich gameplay to anybody's campaign and table, the better. Especially because it gets talked about a lot. Obviously, Gary was a war gamer. Everybody knows the history of the game,
Yeah,
um, of how it came about. It's just that it it's gone away in a lot of ways from those roots. And I feel like, getting back and exploring it and putting it back into the game, is only for the better. I mean, it's not gonna be for everybody. You don't need to have wargaming but I think it adds another layer of play and strategy and tactics that, if you're interested in it, is only going to benefit your games. So I think folks should at least try it once, like anything else.
I agree. In the Appendix N, you got Fritz Lieber, and there's not really any mass combat there, but got a lot of mass combat elsewhere.
Yeah, that's kind of a tragedy. I mean, I love Fafhrd and the Grey Mouser. I guess a little bit though. There's a little bit in it's gonna escape me right now. I know it's technically he didn't write the whole thing, but one of the stories,
Hmm.
the dungeon one, the specific dungeon one, with the different factions, and they're not, I wouldn't call it full blown armies, but platoon scale for sure that was fighting in the
Okay. Yeah,
dungeons.
yeah. No, that's fair. That's
What
fair.
was that one? Everybody's gonna call me out on the podcast on it later, but please do call me out. Everybody that listens to this, but I will think of it and it'll be in the outro. Anyway, that particular
For sure.
that story was fantastic, and I think that one had a lot of opportunity. Obviously, like of course, Gary was inspired by it. Like it definitely influenced the game quite a bit. I know that it's not fully Lieber, but Lieber finished it, and it's good. So there's a little bit there. You could say that
Yep,
Fafford and the Grey Mouser had a little bit of that. There was definitely more
that's fair.
opportunity to put it in, but
Yep, and if that's what people want, cool. But they should try that platoon scale combat and see.
I
Another
think
like you
so.
said, it's another dimension of the game. It's like even if someone wants to play dungeons for 20 levels, cool. But for me, I really like that the game changes, that it starts out dungeon heavy and then moves more into the wilderness and then opens up domain play and armies. And I like that change, that progression, that cycle of a campaign that keeps things different.
I agree. For me, the variety is the spice of life, and I like that in my adventure games as well. So anything that's going to channel that Conan arc, I'm into. So
And John
speaking,
Carter, I like
yeah,
John a lot.
that's true too. That's true too. All right. Well, speaking of that, as we wrap this thing up, there is a system that is specifically named after that Conan arc, Adventure Conquer King. And I
Yep.
hear that there's a Kickstarter running. So give us the background on our what's going on with Adventure Conquer King right now.
Well, Axe was a great system when it came out. It was not the most clearly presented. It disguised some of its brilliance, but it was brilliant and it provided a lot of really useful tools. Axe 2 comes on the back of about a decade of playtesting and revision. And over the last 3, 4 years, some serious look at like what Axe 2 was going to look like and draft rules and testing things. It is just to try to refine that, streamline it, make it clear and make it a little more elegant without losing the nuance there, which I think is the really tricky balance of game design in general. It's trying to figure out what level of abstraction to use and how to balance that. I think Acts 2 has done a really nice job of capitalizing on what Acts originally did well and then just expanding that so that it's got not just good domain rules, but like leaning into the things that it did well at low level adventuring with like cleaves that you can just keep chopping down enemies or like to one thing that they're adding that I've had fun experimenting with in low level dungeons is just lots of rules for spelunking and repelling and squeezing through narrow cracks and things that probably exist somewhere in the AD&D Dungeon Master's Guide and nowhere else. Or like the monster manual, getting to see some of the pieces of that as they're coming together is really impressive. How each monster has its life cycle statted out and derived based on like comparable real world animals, but also scaled based on its size with like value for an egg if you catch one, how many eggs are expected in a nest, and how long until it hatches, and uh, how much it'll be worth if you raise this wyvern into youth and then sell it, and just all of those sorts of things. Or like if you want to uh, Mm, raise a bunch of them and farm them for that. How feasible is that? And like maybe there are some tables that don't care about that. But those are the sorts of things that my players get into their head and want to do. Or like found a gladiatorial arena and start training gladiators in their name. All of those sorts of things that players just settle on and that end up defining a character and that become their really cool, awesome thing that they wanted to do. I've found X gives actual concrete rules for that make it meaningful and distinct, and I really enjoy it. And I think the second edition does a really good job of expanding the breadth of possibilities without expanding the actual like workload of any one thing at the table. That like I like core book is certainly a lot bigger now, but that's because it includes things like a whole chapter on naval rules with points of sail and wind speed and a pop-in climate-based weather generation system. That like if you don't want to use that, sure, you don't have to. It's no extra work for you if you don't. But if you want to use it, it's there. And that sort of optional modular utility is what I really find valuable at the table because it means that, like, I don't need to worry about these rules for gladiators until a player decides I want to start training gladiators to take over this ring and to build myself a secret army within the city. And having the power to back that up and to offer rules on how to do that, I have found really valuable, both at like for low level play, where that's just a downtime activity that they're interested in and that they're starting to get involved in, or like maybe they're fighting as a gladiator and I need to know what sort of prizes are reasonable for that and what sort of opposition they'll go up against and how often that happens. Or if that's a high level thing where like I need to know how much it costs to run gladiatorial games, or like how much money the Thieves Guild can make from rigging the betting. And really, really like being able to give coherent answers to players that ask those sorts of questions, that get invested in a world like that. And giving them the tools to get invested there leads to them then creating those sorts of things and building the sorts of institutions that shape a campaign.
Nice. Yeah, I have found a lot of utility in the Axe rule set for sure. I currently, for a little over a year, been running Axe First Edition, and just just seeing what I like in the rules and giving it. I like to think give things test drives. So I'm not one to just read and browse and then come to a conclusion. It's just not the way that I work. I generally like to, if I'm interested, like if I read it and I browse it and I'm not interested, then yeah, I'm done with it. But if I read something and I'm interested in it in a rule set, then I generally am going to put it into play. X overall was very interesting to me, um, for reasons we've talked about this entire episode, because I really feel like I wanted to integrate mass combat and domain play into my games in a significant way, and Axe has a well-deserved reputation for having rules for that. So I've been putting those rules to the test and enjoying myself and finding what I like, what I don't like about it, and what I'm going to take away and use in my campaigns going forward. And I think that's the key is with Axe is you may like it enough that it becomes your number one, it is your core rule set and it'll definitely serve you well. If you've got other rule sets and you just really like a particular set of modular rules from Axe, it's got value that way. So I think Alex has done a good job of developing a system that you can pull from and put into whatever it is, whatever use case you have for it. So, and I think mass combat and domain level rules for it are definitely worth people checking out if that's something that you are interested in. Or, and I'll say this too, and I could say this conclusively, if you for whatever reason want to stick with a BX game, this is by far the best BX chassis game that exists. No, it's not even close.
Here,
So
here.
yeah, yeah, there's no one's close to where Axe is at with that. So if you enjoy BX, I would say this should be the first system you check out, or like right away. So
I wish it had been.
yeah, no, definitely, definitely. I mean that's the I mean that is the wherever you look the standard. People just have not played enough. They'll basically tell you that, oh yeah, just if you're getting started in old school Dungeons and Dragons, you should definitely you've never played it, pick up the original BX game, right? Or there's other, clones out there that you can pick up depending on what your taste or flavor is or how you want it presented, right? And I that was exactly what I was told, and that's exactly what I did. And it was a good intro, but I quickly realized the limitations of just straight BX. And I needed something more, and I started looking around. So it's probably to where I am now. So I'm grateful for that. And it gave me my first introduction to old school play. So I'm also grateful for that. I just wish more people would push people to recommend Axe specifically if you want to go the BX route. So you'd have a lot more
Yeah.
there.
Well, thank you, Gus,
Yeah, man.
having me
Well,
on.
Yeah, it's my pleasure. Arb, thanks for coming on. We appreciate you. We'll definitely have another episode or two, I think, around this type of play. So we'd love you have you back for that if you're interested. And we wish you the best of luck as well on your nap entry. So that'll be fun to watch that come to fruition. So good luck on that. And I'll give you the last word. Is there anything that you wanted to say or recommend to people that are interested in adding some mass combat or domain play to their game?
All the great fiction that I've really enjoyed has it as part of what characters do. And I think that's really valuable as like just the apex of a character. Conan becomes king, and that is that is his ultimate apotheosis. That's the end point towards which he aspires, eh, ultimately. And I think for characters in my games, I think adding that dimension to them adds just a lot of complexity and nuance, like, and potential for skill and for interesting gameplay there. That even if someone was just mostly interested in the dungeon, I think adding just a bit of domain play around that makes the dungeon play more interesting and gives it additional context, additional resources that they can access to pour into that and to become a better dungeon delver, even if that was what they were focused on. I think everyone should try domain play and a bit of mass combat. That's- I certainly enjoy, and I think not it not nearly enough people have tried.
I couldn't agree more. All right. Thanks, everybody. So I hope everybody got something out of that episode, or at least sparked your curiosity into potentially running a little mass combat, adding a little mass combat into your game, or potentially thinking about running some domain level play when your characters get to that kind of mid to high level that you haven't thought about before. So I know I did, and I'm just grateful for Arb coming on. A couple of things. One is like I mentioned, I could not think of for the life of me what that particular story was from Fitzlieber and the story of the Fafhrd and the Grey Mouser, and it was the Lords of Cornwall. So one of my favorite stories of all the Fafhrd and the Grey Mousers, obviously very influential when it came to creating dungeons and using dungeons in Dungeons and Dragons. So I love that particular story quite a bit, and it did have a little platoon skill that you could probably get some inspiration from, running in your own games at that mass combat level. So you can start with just a couple dozen mercenaries if you're interested. That being said, too, just for my own personal preference, if I wasn't clear on the episode, I've been, or at least in background to you, for the last, I'd say a little over a year, I've been running Axe, the rule set inside, while running through Dwaro Deep, the mega dungeon from most recent mega dungeon from Greg Gillespie. And I really wanted to kind of put the rule system through its paces because it was interesting. It was interesting to me because of the fact that it focused very specifically on moving characters from low levels 1 all the way into 13, 14, and it focused and had a heavy emphasis on mass combat and domain level play, not just within the core book itself but many of the supplements for Axe. So that interested me because that's the type of game I was going on. Long story short, I ended up settling and being very happy with Advanced Dungeons and Dragons First Edition. So that'll be my core rule set for the very long future in front of me. But I do like a lot about what Axe offers, and you can borrow heavily from its subsystems. And so that's how I plan to use the system going forward. Though I will keep on running it until I finish up with my Dwaro Deep campaign because it is a very functional system. If you want to stay within inside of that BX world. So, also that being said, if you are interested in checking out the Axe system, Alexander Macris, the creator of it, is currently running a Kickstarter for Axe 2. You heard Arb speak a little bit to it. But that Kickstarter should still be going for around 36 hours from the time this podcast goes live. So if you listen to the podcast early and you get all the way to the end here, just know that that podcast, that Kickstarter should be going on, and you can check it out. So again, thank you all for tuning in, and we look forward to hearing back from you. Please jump into the Discord. There'll be links for that as usual in each episode of the podcast. Come in, hang out, discuss fantasy adventure gaming with us, and look forward to seeing you there. Take care, everybody.